This is a metaphor for your business's journey. Sometimes it feels like the course keeps changing right before your eyes. And in order to maneuver it, you need an expert by your side. That's what Dell Technologies advisors do. They have the Windows PC and tech solutions you need to help you get out in front and stay ahead of the game. Call an advisor today at 877-ASK-DELL. That's 877-ASK-DELL. A start to a simpler experience with Windows 11 Pro.
All right, BA fam, I have been talking about today's guest for what feels like weeks, and I am so excited to finally be sitting across virtually from a woman who I feel like you kind of know when you're immediately going to connect with someone and just you have the same philosophy about life. You kind of see things through a similar lens. And within the first 10 pages of reading her brand new book, Inclusion on Purpose, I was just like, Ruchika has to be on Brown Ambition, and we have to be friends, and it's going to happen, and this is all happening. And Ruchika Tulshyan is actually here. Hello.
Hello, Mandi. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited. And you actually are aware of Brown Ambition, which is extraordinary to me. It tells me we are branding ourselves correctly if you found us. That is what we want.
You are. And I just want to say that it's a really lonely endeavor to be a brown entrepreneur, right? And build a business, a brown and black entrepreneur, and, essentially part of a demographic that is often, really overlooked and under-sponsored and underestimated and underfunded. And knowing that there's a community out there building, through really, really like tall hardship is what more can you need, right? So please know that the community you're building is really very special and so necessary. And of course, it's my pleasure and honor to be here. And of course, in preparation of this interview, when I listened to Stacey Abrams' interview, that was like a very special, meaningful experience. I mean, firstly, is there anything this person cannot do, right? Like just
Nope.
Just amazing, but also so thoughtful and insightful. The way the questions you asked her and her co-author, Heather, I mean, it was just, you did such a good job, Mandi.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. And what I love about you, I actually listened to your interview with Brene Brown, you and your friend and fellow colleague, Jodi Ann Burry. Is that correct?
Jodi Ann Burry, yeah.
Jodi Ann Burry, excellent work. I'm also trying to get her on Brown Ambition. So if you want to text her, she's probably
Absolutely.
snowboarding or something. But
Yes.
I'm like, Jodi Ann, get on the show.
Oh my gosh, I will text her right away. Of course.
No, but this is the Ruchika show, so we're going to focus on you. Tell me about this book. Well, first, let me tell you my first reaction to reading the book was I was so grateful to it because a part of my story, which if you've listened to Brown Ambition, I spent 5 years in a senior leadership position managing a team. And, it wasn't necessarily a Google or an Amazon, but it was a relatively big fintech company. And I just remember when I, got that job at like 28, 29, feeling this real sense of responsibility, like, I can't fuck this up. I'm a Black woman in charge. I get to hire people. I get to review resumes. I'm going to try to do it. I'm going to try to do things right. I'm going to try to use my little, corner of influence, my little zone of influence, and take small incremental steps toward making this company more inclusive without even telling them. I didn't tell them. I was like a covert operator. Like, oh, there's going to be some Black women in this team and, all that. And what I love about your book is that it really feels like it was written for people in places of power and not necessarily to women of color. We already know it's hard. We already know how challenging it can be. And when you were approaching this book, I mean, I know that's so much of what you talk about. You have a firm where you consult and provide trainings to corporations, but talk to me about intentionally speaking to the people who have the power about this issue.
Yeah, this was actually a very complicated, especially when this book was in proposal stage, it was really complicated because what happens is when you're shopping a book proposal around is you need to have a really clear idea of, and you need to literally state like, who are you trying to reach out to? And for me, it was everyone. I wanted women of color to be able to see this and feel seen and read it and feel validated, because honestly, every author in some way, shape, or form writes the book that they needed and didn't have. And that's how I felt when I even conceptualized the idea of inclusion on purpose, which, by the way, only came to light because a woman of color agent reached out to me years ago and said, hey, I read this one article you wrote on Harvard Business Review. It was not a viral article. It was not like the, imposter syndrome one, which I feel so proud to co-author with Jodi Ann. But it was an article that was very meaningful to me about corporate diversity efforts, leaving out women of color. And she reached out to me and she's like, have you thought about writing a book, another book, a traditionally published one? Do you have an agent? And I was like, no, of course not. Like, I don't know. Me, really? I mean, what could I contribute
But you'd already
to this?
published a book before. So you independently published your first book.
Essentially, yeah. So I was blogging for Forbes, and they were essentially experimenting with an ebook platform, and so the Diversity Advantage was part of that, but not at all a traditional publishing process by any means. No agent, no, which of course is a mistake, by the way. For anyone listening, if you are planning to publish a book in any way, shape, or form, even if you eventually decide to publish independently and self-publish, it's always a good idea to at least talk to an agent. Anyway,
me.
So
That's
that was
me. I'm your audience right now. Keep talking.
Oh, and I'm happy to, by the way, when I was done with my book proposal, I sent it to a lot of people. I sent it specifically to women of color. I said, use what you need from this, do what you want with it. I mean, don't put it on the internet, but however it can help, please, because we have to pass the word on. We need to support each other. But so back to this article, back to this agent, she reaches out, she's like, do you want to write this book? And I'm like, okay, I guess. And then as it started coming to life and I thought about who I want this book to be for, I really wanted it to be for everyone. I wanted it to be, again, for women of color, validating our experience, because, we experienced so much of gaslighting, experienced so much of, that wasn't at all what happened. That wasn't my intention. Like, what matters is my intention was good. So I'm sorry that I, behaved in a way that you found to be biased or racist or sexist, but that wasn't my intention. So it was like that, really hard to balance both worlds of how do you write a book that validates the experiences of women of color, which I really hope, when women of color read the book, and again, not a monolith, but when women of color, brown and Black women read the book, they feel, okay, I feel seen. That wasn't just in my head. I tried specifically to seek out examples of where it wasn't like a horrific example where it would be like a legal case or whatever it is, which obviously is very important. But I was trying to find those very subtle, under the table slights and biases and, what we commonly know as microaggressions, although in the book I talk about why I don't like that word, but those everyday ways of how it shows up and you feel slighted. So I wanted to capture that. And then I also, yes, absolutely wanted to talk to people in power and leadership and, positions of influence and privilege, because at the end of the day, this should never be our problem to solve. Not even close.
If you're worried about anyone feeling seen, all you have to do is read the foreword of the book by Ijeoma Oluma. Is that how you say it?
Olo.
See, you realize I read and I do not say things
Olo.
out loud enough, and I really ought to not do that. But the foreword of this book, I mean, that whole that's what grabbed me, and I was like, oh, so we're gonna go there. You do. I mean, the book really can be for anyone, but what I love is it holds the people who have the power accountable. And I'm curious, tell me a little bit about your work. So you've launched this consulting firm for how long now? And tell me about what you do and what has been some of the feedback you've gotten from people in power and leadership at company who so often, don't look like us, as to why things take so damn long for them to get it together. If you can comment on that, be great.
Oh my gosh. Well, firstly, when you talked about how you were at a fintech company, it took me right back to really what launched my work in diversity, equity, and inclusion well before it was trendy. And about a decade ago, I was at a tech company, and it was a very, very painful and lonely experience. In that company, I was the only woman of color in my department. I felt very hypervisible and invisible at the same time, which, academic research shows is very much the experience of women of color when we're the only, the first, one of the few, the different. As Shonda Rhimes calls us the FODs. So
Wait, what's
I had a
FODs?
FOD, first, only different.
Oh, right. Okay. That's awesome.
So
And you're right.
yeah,
It is hyper. It's like that even what you just said, it's like the same thing. You feel hypervisible and invisible at the same time. Hypervisible for me, it was like hypervisible when I screwed something up. Like everyone was
hmm
going to know and I was going to be, whatever, held back by it. And then invisible when the fun stuff came along is how it felt.
Oh yeah,
Mm.
yeah, very painful, very lonely, and often you don't know where you can turn. And one of the reasons why I then, I went through this experience, I quit, I leaped into entrepreneurship, didn't know what was coming, had somewhat of a safety net because I'd been saving. And then I also, I'm married to a spouse who works in tech, who worked and continues to work in tech. So I could take that leap in a way that I know that for so many women of color I've spoken to since, and even for the book, it's very, very tough. And I acknowledge my privilege being able to do that. And as I got into consulting, also completely inadvertently, it wasn't planned. At that time, there was no real language around diversity, equity, and inclusion that was really meaningfully being heard, right? There were those really big vendors that would get these big contracts with these big companies, and they would do a sort of check the box exercise. They'd be like compliance and legal,
Yeah.
which, of course, I'm not a lawyer. So there was that. And then there was me over here trying to say, there needs to be more. There has to be more to address the more subtle but very harmful behaviors that we are seeing day in and day out, that I'm hearing about, that I experience, that I'm researching about. And so when I launched Candor, and it's not very old, I incorporated Candor, my consulting firm, in 2017. So it's actually not even that old.
Okay.
I did it when my child was less than a year old. And I really, in many ways, just did it because I was like, well, I'll go back into some sort of like a corporate space eventually, right? Like I'm trained as a journalist. Maybe I'll just take a few more years off. Maybe I'll do a couple of like short projects, probably not going to make a lot of money, and then go back into something more full time. And maybe it was the moment, maybe it was the timing, maybe it was the fact that we reached this point of no return after the 2016 elections. But something just switched for me, and in many ways, I think for a lot more corporate leaders. So the conversations I was starting to happen, even before 2017, but really since 2017, was more corporate leaders saying, I see that there's a problem. Like I'm really seeing it now. And even if I want to make a change, I don't know how, I don't know where to get started. Many folks had really good intentions, but did not really think about the impact or care about the impact or have words to talk about the impact that they were having on women of color, especially Black and brown women. And I think that led me to want to write this book. I started doing it through my other writing. I explored through all my other writing. I was really exploring this reality that was so clear to me, that for women of color, the workplace was so different than the experience of white women in the workplace. Mm-hmm. And I never thought that there would be appetite for it. And the fact that there is, it really is remarkable right now.
Yeah. You mentioned your launch into entrepreneurship, and I'm kind of nodding my head because I just launched my own entrepreneurial journey this past summer. Yeah, I know it hasn't even been a year yet. I'm a newborn entrepreneur. And I too had privilege. I had squirreled away money, and I had to ask myself, what was it all for if I can't just dive off this cliff and see what happens, And then my husband, who I've talked about, he's my health insurance card. That's what he that's
Same here.
Yeah,
Same here, by the way.
isn't it nice?
It is
Although
nice.
I tell women all the
It really
time,
is.
there's the healthcare marketplace, you can make it happen. But
You can.
let's talk about entrepreneurship, because I mean, you also share this stat in the book, which I want to pull up really quickly, and there's a couple of different stats, also, other data that has shown that women of color are just the fatigue, and I'm imagining two big factors are 2016 election and the summer of 2020, just sort of
Mm-hmm.
culminated in the sense of like, get us out of here. Like,
Yeah.
get us out of this place. We're so tired of it. And what I feel like is happening is right at the point when companies are finally almost getting it and starting to invest more in these initiatives, for a lot of us, it's like too little too late.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, I want to get your take on that, because I have a group coaching cohort called the Mandi Moneymakers. My 8th week is this week. My first cohort is done, and I'm 24 amazing women of color. We're in this first cohort, and we had, I don't know if it was last week or week before, I talked all about intrapreneurship and entrepreneurship and how to be entrepreneurial at work and how that benefited my career. And I remember a couple of times, one of my makers was like, "But Mandi, like, you left corporate America. Is there no hope?" And I feel deeply that there is hope, but yet I'm also like, for me, the story was a little bit over. But how do you sort of respond to those questions? Because I'm with you. I do believe that there's good intentions out there, that people are willing to change and want to change and create a better place for women of color to work. But I also grapple with, for some of us who's too little too late, yeah, go in and get out, girl. Take your talent elsewhere. Two things can be true. What do you feel about that?
Literally what you said, two things can be true. And I've met a lot of people who are in corporate environments where they have felt supported and seen and heard. They may not have always felt that way, but they've landed in a place where they do feel that way. They feel really, they get a lot of meaningful joy out of the work that they do, the team that they interact with. They want to be part of like a bigger picture within an organization. And for a while, that was me. I really did feel that way. I was very excited and energized by the work I was doing. What became far too much to bear, far too toxic in the long run, and this was even before I had a child. I cannot imagine what it would have felt like to come home to a child with some of the toxicity I was dealing with at that time. And how could I really be present as a person, as a human being, as a mom, as a caretaker? But I think, for some people, they really like that environment. They really, they like the work they do. They find it to be meaningful. Entrepreneurship is not for everyone, right? And I actually think that there's a specific type of person in my sort of group of friends who are entrepreneurs and the people I admire. Like, you do have to be really ready to take that risk, right? Mm-hmm. It is risky. And whether it's because you have a safety net or whether it's because there's some other reason, but that risk is a very big part of it. And I hate that for women of color who may not want to take that risk, for whom they know entrepreneurship is not the way forward, when they feel compelled to make that leap because they're having such a terrible experience in the workplace, they're experiencing racism and bias and sexism and misogyny and all of those things, I really wish that there was a better way. And that's why I can't think of a more urgent, leadership sort of quality, trait, priority, call it what you want, than inclusion, right? Then really focusing and prioritizing what are people who have historically been marginalized, left out, overlooked, underestimated. What are they feeling? What are they going through? How can I use my privilege to change that experience so that we retain this amazing, innovative, ambitious? Mm-hmm. That's the part that always I feel like it gets hidden, but the data is so clear. Women of color, and this is women of color, we know, not a monolith across, categories, which demographics, etc. Women of color are consistently far more ambitious than our white counterparts, our white women counterparts. So the fact that we are leaving, the fact that we are not getting the support and the, support and sponsorship and funding that we need, we're getting underpaid, we're getting overlooked. it really breaks my heart, because the opportunity in my mind is endless to retain and to promote women of color who are ambitious, who are not, who are not leaving for the reasons that our media keeps bandying about. They as soon as they become moms, they want to leave. I mean, the data around women of color does not show that.
Oh, please. As soon as we become moms, I wanted nothing more than to go back to work.
Yes. Yes.
Maternity leave was
Yes.
not good for me mentally.
No, it wasn't for me either. Yes.
Oh, okay.
And these are the stories I don't hear, right? The stories I hear in the media this is why your work is so important, because what I hear is like, you feel so shameful and it's so terrible, and you're like, it's so hard to have to go back to work and all of that. And I think of women of color and this is why specifically in my book I did not have a chapter around women of color and caregiving, because I said our realities are so different and they're also varied. It's so nuanced that you can't capture it in one book. But for a lot of women of color, we've not had that luxury of choice. Like, we've not had that luxury. Many of us have ancestors and family and friends who've had to go back right after giving birth, right? Because of the lack of social structures in this country, where there wasn't that privilege of choice.
Yeah. And I think even more so, if you are lucky enough, like I was, to have paid parental leave, which is just not, it's astonishing to me that in this country, we still are like one of a handful that don't offer it. But that I almost felt like I need to get back. I'm missing out. And I think that's also the why we call the show Brown Ambition, is because you understand that it's really, sometimes people have such low expectations for us when we walk in the room. It's really criminal. And so I feel like we overcompensate. We ratchet up our expectations on ourselves. And then we're like, and now we got to go. And, it's not like people are necessarily thinking, when's this person going to come back or whatnot? But we know that we have to seize every opportunity we have to make an impact so that we can keep going. And I get it, like that sense of fatigue. And especially with my makers, talking to them week in and week out, several, there's been people, women are really getting emotional, and it is exhausting, the labor of all of this. I want to talk to you a little bit about, I know your book very much is about inclusive practices in business and among leaders, which is incredible. But, for anyone listening who's struggling with that type of fatigue, talk about some like coping mechanisms for that. And and it's not always the right approach, for better or worse, is not always to go to HR and air it out, because it may not be resolved. It may not be resolved in the way that actually helps you. But I feel like a lot of us are cobbling together those coping mechanisms now. And I wanted to kind of talk to you about that. What do you find working as a woman of color yourself, and for people that you talk to help us kind of get through it?
Yeah. Not at all to be self-serving, but there's so much that I wish was available when I was going through this. And by the way, as an entrepreneur, you still do. I mean, it's not like I became an entrepreneur and suddenly everyone was like, oh, let me open the doors for you. I've been, again, overlooked, underestimated regularly. I mean, literally as of like 1-2 weeks ago, I've had experiences when Ijeoma Ulo and I were talking backstage before the launch last week. We shared some really ridiculous examples of how, she's a New York Times bestselling author. And we were talking about experiences where, even she had definitely been, overlooked and underestimated. So I think the number one thing is, when I think about my contribution to this all, it is hopefully my body of work and others is, this is not done in a silo by any stretch of the imagination, but hopefully finding your stories reflected, knowing that you're not alone, knowing that whatever you may hear in the workplace, like, no, we didn't mean it that way. I mean, I have so many stories of what it was like to be in corporations where they're like, it's all in your head, or no, that's just the way it's done here, or maybe you can't deal with it, or maybe you're not strong enough, maybe you're not smart enough. Like those sorts of invalidations it's not a paper cut, by the way, which, I mean, again, the sort of white feminism, corporate feminism movement calls it, death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's not. It really feels like sometimes like a knife in your back all the time, quite a lot. I don't want to say all the time, but quite a lot. So having resources that validate your experience, reading podcasts, I mean, communities like this, I think are really valuable. And because I can think of a time where I needed it and I didn't have it. And then so I started blaming myself. I started falling prey to, all sorts of feelings of I'm not good enough, imposter syndrome, this idea of not belonging. It's something to do with me. If only I fill in the blank, did this, I would be able to progress. I'd be able to cope with it better. And having, tools around that is really helpful. The tribe, the community, again, when I moved to Seattle 9 years ago, it's a very white place. And a lot of the folks that I connected with initially and was sort of introduced to, everyone was white. And so when I would talk about my experiences, I could see I was making a lot of white people uncomfortable or like, oh, no, even if they weren't part of the organization, they'd be like, no, I mean, that it wasn't that. I'm sure that wasn't what they meant. And that white fragility, I mean, it is not, I don't think it's any surprise that Robin DiAngelo's work on white fragility, Ijeoma Ulo's work on So You Want to Talk About Race and Mediocre, a lot of that generates from the Seattle, Washington area, which is very white, very liberal.
I never thought about that, but yeah, that's
true. And the reason why I bring that up is because the experience is even more toxic. Like I moved from, before that I lived in Atlanta. I was a business journalist in Atlanta. Before that I lived in New York, and then I've lived in other countries around the world. Seattle is so specific and unique. It is liberal, right? We've always voted blue for as long as I think, there are records. And so because there is that sort of liberal umbrella, the slights and that everyday racism, quote, casual racism, isn't fully explored or understood or even accepted.
Yeah, you really are kind of like at the epicenter of white fragility. I just realized I visited Seattle and I didn't like it. Maybe you're articulating why.
It's
but I also
super tough place.
It's like Park Slope, but bigger, way bigger. Park Slope, Brooklyn, which is like a super gentrified part of Brooklyn here in New York, where I am on the other side of the world. Yeah. I mean, kudos to you for staying there and fighting the good fight. Because
back to the tribe, you need your tribe, And so I started slowly building that, because when you're going through this experience and experiences, you need a tribe. You need people to remind you that it's not just in your head. It's not just you. No, if you do more power poses, you're not going to just suddenly overcome those feelings that you're feeling. And that became really important and meaningful for me.
Thank you for reaffirming what I am always talking about. It's human beings, it doesn't matter if you've got 2, 3, 500 or just, 5 people that you can kind of turn to for support. But I remember when I was at my last, when I was a senior director at my last company, I recruited, and she's still there. Her name's Ismet Mangla. I love her. She was my assistant content director. And I remember I waited like 6 months to find her. And this was my secret vendetta. I knew that I was coming on 5 years and I was probably going to be leaving. Or if I was, I just wanted to be sure that my successor, I was going to leave things equal. I wanted a woman of color. I did. So if Joe Biden was going to go out, like he said, I'm going to go find a Black female Supreme Court justice, I was like, I'm going to find a woman of color to replace me, unapologetically. I didn't broadcast it, but I knew that's what I was doing. And I just remember how less lonely I felt having Ismet there. And, we shared a boss, and, he was well-meaning, but flawed. And so much of that crap became so much easier to deal with because Ismet was there. because they could chat about it. And, I think that's what it's about. It's like the small things that happen on a day to day. Not everything is like file a complaint worthy or quit your job worthy, but it does exhaust. And, just having a quick outlet to laugh about that, or constantly just like, well, now you can't do it anymore because you don't have cubicles. A lot of us are working at home, but just turning around because Ismet sat behind me and just kind of being like, did you see this shit? And like having that bit of connection. Selfishly, that's why I went about building my team. So it was so chock full of diverse talent because I wasn't going to find that community at the company. I created it myself. And when I was doing that session with makers last week and talking about this particular session was about encouraging leadership and pursuing leadership opportunities. And I could start to hear, a couple of folks who were very cynical about it. Like, it seems like a lot of work. Are we really going to, it seems like it's even harder to get to the top. So why should we try? Why bother trying? All I can do is point back to that time when I was able to create that team and say, that's why it is hard and more challenging than it ought to be for talented folks to find those positions. But the impact that you can have, I mean, I can toot my own, I'm so proud of that, and it's one of the, I have to work on my responses for this too. Maybe you do too. You're in book tour mode, but I want to convince more women of color to go for those leadership opportunities. It's the hard thing to do, but the impact, like if you just think about what ripples you can create, isn't that worth it?
It's so worth it. And it's so worth it. And kudos to you for doing that. I also think what has happened all this while is that there is a sharp elbows mentality. Firstly, the way white supremacy and white capitalist patriarchy has pitted us against one another. So if you are from different communities of being a woman of color, a lot of women of color, especially newer immigrant women of color like myself, immigrant women of color to this country, they don't associate with being women of color. They don't, that social and political identity is one that many reject because of that concern of like, no, the way to get ahead and the way to achieve the American dream is to reject that solidarity, to reject my identity, and to assimilate and integrate and uphold white supremacy. And perpetuate anti-Blackness, frankly, in many cases too. And so I think really leaning hard into our social and political identity as women of color, showing up for one another, really advocating for one another, because it takes so much of work to get to those leadership positions. And I suspect one of the reasons, apart from dealing with that BS day in and day out, on the workplace side, is also not feeling like anyone has your back, even within your own community, right? And I would love for more of us to band together and find ways to support women of color to get into these high positions. One of the people I interviewed for the book, Erin Okuno, who is, by the way, based in the Seattle area, is part of a group that really supports women of color candidates running in especially like school board and other state elections, sort of very meaningful positions of political power here in Washington state, but making sure that there really is a group of women of color and some advocates and allies supporting those women of color to run. Because it's not just about money, it's not just about fundraising, it's not just about that. It's the visibility process, the communication, all of that. And then it's the emotional labor and support for you knowing that you're going to be, again, hyper scrutinized and invisible at the same time, right? Women of color candidates here in Washington state, some of the stories, some of the few that I've actually spoken to in person have talked so much about experiencing such horrific, online abuse and scrutiny and even racism from the media and whatnot. And you really need that tribe behind you saying, I believe in you. Power on, you're doing this for us. Whatever you need, we're here for you. so I hope this book also catalyzes that movement and that solidarity and camaraderie among women of color, different communities of women of color, as well as obviously, yeah, I know it's like I want everything. I want all the things.
Yeah.
And who knows what's actually going to happen and, where it actually lands. But I really would like that too.
Hey BA fam, Brown Ambition is proud to be sponsored by BetterHelp Online Therapy. Relationships take work, especially the most important one you can have in your life, your relationship with yourself. A lot of us will drop anything to go help anyone else we care about. We'll go out of our way to treat other people well. But when it comes to ourselves, do we really give ourselves the same treatment? So this month, BetterHelp Online Therapy wants to remind you that you matter just as much as everyone else does. And therapy is a great way to make sure you show up for yourself. BetterHelp is online therapy that offers video, phone, and even live chat sessions with your therapist. It's much more affordable than in-person therapy, and you can be matched with a therapist in under 48 hours. Give it a try and see why over 2 million people have used BetterHelp Online Therapy. Brown Ambition is sponsored by BetterHelp, and Brown Ambition listeners, that's right, BA fam, you get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/brownambition. That's BETTERHELP.com/brownambition.
I want to talk about even kind of a controversial topic that came up. I know I'm talking about the makers a lot, but man, that's such a fun, focus group I get to chill out with every week and just kind of hear where their heads are at. And one of the controversial things we discussed was I've been pretty honest and open that in my career, one of my most meaningful mentors, allies, whatever you want to call him, was a white male at my company, and how I benefited from his endorsement throughout my journey. And I encourage, because I feel like as Black women, we do find our tribe, we find our community. Those of us who are smart enough to do that, if you haven't do it, I mean, you're listening to Brown Ambition. So I feel like, you're in the right place, you're doing something. But if once we kind of find our people, our community and people that we can commiserate with and just lean on for support, it's also important, I think, for us to be open to even diversifying the people who can help us. And sometimes, of course, I mean, so much the people who have the privilege, my former boss, for example, him recognizing his influence and then helping me and guiding me and kind of offering, speaking my name in rooms that he was in, I can acknowledge that was a reason I was able to advance. I mean, of course, I did the great work, but having that endorsement, I realized the power in that. And I want to encourage women, and I'll get your take on this too, that, even if you're not in a company where the people with the power and privilege are recognizing that they should reach down and pull us up, that you are open to the idea of reaching up or reaching over to even diversify your, your bench of sponsors and allies, people who could potentially help you advance. And unfortunately, the math is not in our favor. A lot of them don't look like us. So, what are your thoughts on that? Is that, am I going to get canceled for saying that?
You're 100% right.
Okay, good, because I won't edit it out now. If you say I'm not going
no,
to
don't.
cancel.
No, and by the way, we can and we totally should have different points of view as well. There's no one path to success, especially for women of color, because we are creating it as we walk it.
You're so right.
We are literally flying the plane as we're building it, right? We're building and flying at the same time, because right now there's very little runway, right? We've not really seen much or nearly enough. And no, again, the reason why I felt this book was so necessary and urgent is because if more people with privilege and power, white male privilege, socioeconomic privilege, cis male privilege, would turn around and say, actually, where do I have, influence? Where are the rooms where my voice is heard and reverberates, and whose names can I speak? If more men could do that, if more white men could do that, the world would look so different, because they do that for each other, right? Research on sponsorship finds 3/4 of white men or of sponsors sponsor people of the same race and gender as them. So if you're going to be a white man and you're in a position where you can sponsor someone, you can speak someone's name, we should really have this person do this top job or get promoted or, lead the big leadership meeting, 3 out of 4 times that's going to be someone of the same race and gender as them. So you do have to disrupt the way more of us have been conditioned. Some say hardwired. We know race is a social construct, but still in many ways we have been hardwired to prefer sameness. And as we have evolved as a society, sameness has meant race and gender, which is ridiculous because if you actually look at it from a scientific and a DNA standpoint, it's like negligible, right? The differences are negligible. But what I've found is without that awareness, without that intentionality, it's not going to change. And therefore, I'm less, my focus and the sort of what I'm trying to build is less around women of color should reach up and find the sponsor. I think it's necessary where you have that ability to do so, where there are opportunities to connect. And therefore, some of what I recommend in the book is make sure as an organization or as a leader, you do have opportunities to connect people at different levels, off different backgrounds, make sure they're in each other's orbit so that those relationships can happen. And my focus is much more on the systemic, how can white male leaders or white women leaders make sure that they are also amplifying and sponsoring and making room and giving credit to women of color. Because that's something that's missing in the pie. I think a lot of it is, when I used to come in and speak about women's leadership, which now I do very carefully and thoughtfully. Before it was like, yes, anyone who'll have me, I'll come in. And now when I do it, I'm very careful not to go into the blame of like, you need to do this and you need to try and get a meeting with this person, that person. I mean, I remember how hard I hustled when I started Candor. I remember how many people I tried to make connections with to try and sponsor me, people in positions of power and leadership, and how many turned away from me. And it was one very specific example of a white man at a very well-known organization who literally bat for me, literally went against a lot of the structures that were set up in the organization that did not want me to engage with them. He literally went to bat for me. He literally went and said, I will only work with Ruchika. I will only work with Candor. You have to figure this out on your end.
Yeah, we need 100
That's
million
what you
more
need.
of those.
Yes, we do.
We do. And you're absolutely right. It is. And this is why I kind of feel like mailing a copy of this book to or even not even mailing, but I feel like as a litmus test for anyone interviewing for a job, ask them if they've heard of Ruchika's book and if it's on the desk of the CEO. and if the answer is yes, then that's probably a safe space for you to go to work. And what I love in my work recently has it's become cool now to quit and stuff, but like I was doing it way before. And so were you quitting places where things were just where there was a ceiling instead of waiting for the ceiling to move. And like I said, for some of us, it's like we don't have time to wait for them to catch up to us. Like we have families, we have generational poverty, we may have, families relying on us, family members relying on us for children. Or just our damn selves. We just want to have a nice life. Okay. We want to have the in-unit washer dryer. We want to DoorDash on the weekends. Like we want to get the nice bottle of wine from the top shelf, not the bottom where it's like $7. You know what I mean? That's fine. So
you're speaking my love language.
Right? Yeah. And for us, it's okay to leave a place where you don't have the support. But what I don't want people to feel like is there's not places where you can be supported. It just is a higher bar. It's a higher bar. And that's why it's more important for us than ever to talk to one another. Where are you happy? Where have you been happy to work? And how can I scoop you up and bring you over here? And I loved I actually really loved the place I worked for 5 years. It was a wonderful place. And I was like, come get this money, y'all. Come on. I'm gonna get you some equity. They got sign-on bonuses. Like I wanted to help other people build wealth in my own little small way. So yeah, I generally feel optimistic as much as there's plenty to be cynical about and plenty to be pessimistic about. I generally do have hope for women of color in corporate America that things will keep incrementally improving. At the same time, like, I agree with you that we have to sometimes move things in our favor a little bit quicker because we just can't wait for everyone to catch up. And to make these changes are not necessarily immediate quick fixes, how to become a more inclusive workplace. Right? I mean, they're going to take time. So if it's not there yet, it's go on and get out and go somewhere where it's fine, where it's
Absolutely. You
better.
should go literally that. I mean, during the whole Nicole Hannah-Jones saga, I kept seeing this quote again and again, right? Go where you are celebrated, not just tolerated. And in some cases, not even tolerated. I think that is a very important piece of advice to keep top of mind. And I think because women of color are expected to be grateful, to be, fill in the blank here, like whatever the word is, submissive or grateful, or like, oh, I'm just so thankful that like someone would give me a job. We're supposed to just be okay with crappy conditions? Absolutely not.
Yeah.
And I understand and I recognize and acknowledge the privilege inherent in that statement, which is why I understand like this is not, I wish that every single person, and I envision a world, and I want to be optimistic for a world where every single person has the opportunity to do that for themselves. I do think that there are a lot of people in between where there is an opportunity to move to better and greater things, and you or the way that you've been conditioned holds you back. And I really hope that for folks listening to this, you really sit down and think, what are the ways that I can make my dreams come true? Because, life is short. We know life is really precious. The time we're living in right now is absolutely wild in a not good way, right? So how can you make your dreams come true?
It's so hard. And I love that you pointed that out, because sometimes it's not like any one person sat you down and said, you're not going to go anywhere. You're not going to be anybody. It's never that easy to pinpoint that was the person. So often it's like us being conditioned and then us wielding that abuse toward ourselves, and like the verbal abuse, the, holding yourself back, and how to unlearn that. I'm like, add to that community your therapist, your career coach, your mentors, whatever you need. I feel like we're never that self-doubt, that kind of nefarious, noxious gas of self-doubt that we just kind of, I don't know. I personally feel like I have a cloud. I'm just always trying to keep it at bay. And I've just kind of made peace. It's not that it's not going to go away. It's just I have to, call it what it is and recognize it, and then just like shoo it away to get through the next thing. And I want that. And especially if you're ambitious like we are, things are only going to get more challenging. That's what we want, right? More challenging, more scary, more opportunity for doubt to creep in. And it's like, how do we unlearn all of that?
How do we channel it, right? I think there's unlearn, and then there's also how do you challenge it and challenge it and channel it, because the other thing for me, and this is a little more cultural, but growing up outside the United States, the one thing people will say in common in general about Americans outside of America is people will talk about this amazing confidence that Americans have, or the American culture, which we know, like white American culture, like there's a, what is culture? But there's this perception that to make it here, you got to scream from the rooftops. You got to be really comfortable with self-promoting, and you got to show up a very certain way, which largely is, essentially like a typical white guy, right? Like, I know what I'm doing and I have all the answers. And I actually think, why not, as we think about building a better workplace and getting more women of color into senior leadership positions, why not create more leadership styles? Why not say it's completely okay to be, you can totally be a leader and be more quiet and more thoughtful and more introverted. I'm extremely uncomfortable with self-promotion. This last week and the weeks leading up to this book, and then some of the things I have coming down the pike for me are very difficult. They really, and it's the self-doubt is less like I'm not good enough or I don't feel confident in my abilities. I do, but this is just not the way that I feel comfortable sharing this. I'm a writer, so where I feel comfortable is sitting down and writing the thing. And then that's it. I don't want to get up and talk about how wonderful I am. But it's not because I don't think I'm wonderful. It's because this isn't my medium. This isn't the way that I do it. And so why not, as we reimagine workplaces for women of color and leadership for women of color, I would love to have different styles. I would love for it to be completely acceptable for someone to be like, I don't want to self-promote and I'm not going to do it this way. And then for someone who feels very comfortable self-promoting, they do it that way. And that's totally fine and acceptable too. And then it's less about, am I confident or not? What do I do to get rid of my self-doubt? All of those. And it's more about how do I channel this in a healthy way to do the things and make my dreams come true.
Yeah. And I'll just add to that, as leaders, recognizing the varied personalities on your team and what various individuals may need to be their best. That was the emotional, invisible labor of being a manager that I don't think is taught, is recognizing how many different people need different styles. And I had to force myself to learn how to help them thrive. And everyone is a little bit different. And it was when I realized how much work that was, I was like, oh, no wonder they don't do this, because it's a lot of extra work on me, thinking of different ways to communicate and how to host this and how to make, it was worthy work. But yeah, I would challenge that to managers to recognize that just because someone in a meeting or someone's personality is a different style, that they may need something else, something more, something less than what other people have in order to get the best out of them. And that we should be supported, in our work environments to kind of succeed in our own styles, just like you were saying. Oh, thank you so much for joining Brown Ambition. You guys have to go get a copy of Ruchika's book, Inclusion on Purpose. It is out now. Let's give bestseller vibes, okay? Bestseller sprinkles of magic. And if you are someone working in corporate America, buy this book, take it to work with you, leave a copy on whose ever desk where that may be read and they may need to see it. Ruchika, where can people find you to get candor, to get your amazing insights? To potentially work with you, go to your website, tell us where to go. Where can they find you?
Thank you. I'm very active on Twitter and my handle is rtulshyan, so RTULSHYAN. If you want to check out my website, it's inclusiononpurpose.co, so .co, and that will lead you directly to my website. It's very easy to get in contact with me. And my hope is, with this book, longer conversation for another day, but my hope with this book is that more women of color know that they can write books, that their voices are valued and heard. Who knows how this book will do, but I would love to see more women of color become best-selling authors so that the publishing industry doesn't turn us away and say, 90% of books published are written by white authors. And so I really hope that we can all co-create a different future together.
You're extraordinary. And I can't wait to talk to you again. I feel like if I keep doing what I'm doing right in life, I'll just find myself in your circle and in your world, and it'll all be wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your point of view, sharing your time, sharing your energy with us. Y'all definitely go check out Ruchika's book. Again, it's Inclusion on Purpose. It is out now. We will have a link to the book in the show notes so you can pick up your copy and more for your friends and family and coworkers. Ruchika, all the best, okay? Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And to you too.